What if the men in black were real? On the 21st of June, 1947, a harbor patrol boat operator named Harold Dahl took his 15-year-old son out to Maury Island in Puget Sound off the coast of Washington state. A black Labrador was tied to a tree on the beach. Around 2 in the afternoon, 6 donut-shaped objects came over the water in a loose formation and dropped what Dahl later described as a sheet of light metal, hot and slag-like, onto the sand. The boy picked it up and burned his hand. The dog started barking. One of the objects tilted, a flap on its side opened, and a stream of molten material came out. It hit the dog and killed it on the spot, hit the boy and burned his arm, hit Dahl and burned his face. The 6 objects then drifted south, slowly, and were gone. Dahl's employer, a wartime intelligence officer named Fred Chrisman, sent the report up his chain. Within 2 weeks, the incident reached the Army Air Forces. 2 intelligence officers, Captain William Davidson and Lieutenant Frank Brown, were dispatched to investigate. They flew into McCord Field in Tacoma on the 1st of August, met with Dahl, and took a piece of the slag back with them. The next day, the B-25 carrying them to Hamilton Field in California caught fire in midair and crashed. Both officers were killed. Whatever was in the slag was never recovered. Within days of the crash, 2 men in dark suits arrived at Dahl's house. They said they were from a government agency, but did not name it or show credentials. They asked Dahl to stop talking about the incident, warned him that his family was at risk, and left. Dahl was, in his own later account, frightened out of the story for years. 3 things are on the record. A credible witness reported a strange encounter. The men who went to investigate the encounter died on the flight home. 2 men in suits came to the witness's door within days and asked him to stop talking. The pattern of that visit is the pattern the rest of the Men in Black story is built on. The phrase Men in Black did not exist before the early 1950s. It came out of a small UFO group in Bridgeport, Connecticut, called the International Flying Saucer Bureau, run by a man named Albert K. Bender. Bender was 26 in 1952, had been running the bureau out of his apartment since 1950, and had been receiving reports of a strange figure appearing in connection with UFO cases, a man in a dark suit with an oddly smooth face and a thin-lipped mouth that never quite moved, asking strange questions and then leaving. In late 1953, Bender claimed in a confidential letter to other bureau members that 3 men in dark suits had come to the IFSB office, told him to shut the bureau down, said they were from a government agency, and warned him about continuing. The bureau closed within weeks. Bender told almost no one about the visit at the time. The magazine had been losing readers, and he had other reasons to step back. In the fall of 1956, Bender published a small book called Flying Saucers and the 3 Men, telling the full story. The book sold modestly, but it did something more durable. It put the phrase Men in Black into circulation and gave a vocabulary to the strange visitors UFO witnesses were starting to describe. Looking at Bender's account now, what is striking is how thin the evidentiary base is. He did not name the agency. He did not give license plate numbers. He could not, in the original letter, even give a consistent number of visitors. The strangeness, in his telling, was a feeling rather than a fact, and the feeling is the part that has carried forward. On the 19th of September, 1967, a man named Gary Wilcox was driving north on a back road outside Keene in the southwestern corner of New Hampshire. Wilcox was 28, ran a small used car lot and a set of rental cabins, and was not, in his own later account, looking for anything strange. A small object came down out of the sky and hovered a few feet off the ground, about 40 feet from his car. It was silver, about the size of a car, with a dome on top, no visible landing gear, no wings, and a small hooded opening where a window would be. Wilcox got out and walked toward it. As he came close, A figure appeared in the hooded opening, about 5 feet tall, wearing a shiny, metallic gray suit with no visible features other than 2 large, dark, wide-set eyes. The figure was looking directly at Wilcox. It did not speak. Wilcox later described what followed as a telepathic exchange, a sense that the visitors had been watching Earth for a long time, that they had bases in the solar system, and that they were concerned about how the human species was treating its own planet. The exchange lasted, in his telling, a few minutes. The object then rose, slowly, and was gone. 2 days later, 2 men in dark suits arrived at his used car lot in a black car. They were tall, with olive complexions and what Wilcox described as abnormally long fingers. They asked him where he had been, told him to stop talking about the encounter, and warned him about what would happen if he did not. Wilcox was visibly shaken. What makes the Wilcox case matter, for our purposes, is that it is the first time the MIB visit was thoroughly documented by a serious investigator. John Fuller, a journalist who had previously written about the Betty and Barney Hill case for the Saturday Evening Post, came to New Hampshire in October of 1967, spent days with Wilcox, and published Incident at Exeter, one of the foundational MIB documents. The behavioral details in the Fuller notes recur, in different forms, in MIB cases for the next decade. Most of what we know about the Men in Black comes from a small UFO researcher in Clarksburg, West Virginia, named Gray Barker. Barker was a journalist by training and a showman by temperament. He published a magazine called The Saucerian, which ran through the late 1950s and the early 1960s, and a series of books on the paranormal. The most important of those books, for our purposes, is the slim self-published volume They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, which came out in 1956. That book is a collection of MIB-type stories Barker collected from witnesses around the country. Some are first-hand, some are second-hand, and most are short. The book did not invent the MIB pattern, but it was the first sustained treatment of the pattern as a pattern, and it was widely read in the small UFO community of the period. Barker also kept, in private, detailed files on the MIB cases he heard about. Those files are now in the West Virginia University Library, in the Gray Barker collection. Researchers have been going through them since the early 2000s. The files run to many hundreds of pages and document case after case of dark-suited visitors showing up at the homes of UFO witnesses, often within days of the encounter. The behavioral pattern in the files is consistent. Visitors drive black cars, usually late-model American sedans, a Cadillac, a Lincoln, a Chevrolet. They are described as wearing dark suits, white shirts, dark ties, often with a hat. Their complexions are slightly off, sometimes olive, sometimes gray, sometimes too smooth. They speak in short, declarative sentences, do not explain themselves, do not produce credentials, do not name an agency, ask the witness to stop talking, and then leave. What the files do not contain, despite decades of trying, is any hard evidence that the visitors were who they claimed to be. No arrest records, no photographs, no plates traced to a government vehicle, no smoking gun document. What the files do contain is 100 first-hand accounts, all describing the same kind of visitor, doing the same kind of visit, in the same kind of car, in the same kind of way. The pattern is real. The identities of the men are not. One of the things that makes the Men in Black case unusual as a piece of folklore is the consistency of the behavioral pattern across many decades and many witnesses. We are not talking about a single witness, a single time period, or a single region. We are talking about a pattern reported across the United States in urban and rural settings, from the late 1940s through the late 1970s, with a smaller number of cases continuing into the 80s and 90s. The pattern has about 5 recurring elements. First is the appearance. The men are described as wearing dark suits, clean-shaven, with short hair, looking, in the witness's word, official. They also look, in the witness's word, slightly wrong. The skin is too smooth, the wrong color. The lips do not move the way lips are supposed to move. The eyes are too wide set, or too dark, or too unblinking. The witness cannot always say what is off, only that something is. Second is the car. It is almost always black, almost always a late-model American sedan, almost always a Cadillac, a Lincoln, or a Chevrolet, described as clean, almost too clean, with no dust, no road grime, no wear. The license plate is often reported as missing, out of state, or unreadable in the light available. Third is the timing. The visit almost always comes within 48 hours of the UFO encounter, almost always to the witness's home or workplace, almost always at night, and almost always lasts less than 30 minutes. The visitors leave without ever sitting down. Fourth is the conversation. The visitors ask what the witness saw, do not explain how they know, do not produce a card, and warn the witness, in some versions threatening the witness with vague consequences. They do not say who they are, do not say what agency they are from, and do not give a phone number to call back. The conversation, when the witness tries to reconstruct it later, is often described as hard to remember in detail. Words become slippery, sequence becomes hard to reconstruct. The witness feels that the conversation did not quite happen the way conversations are supposed to happen. Fifth is the emotional residue. The witnesses, almost without exception, report being frightened by the visit, unable to sleep for days, losing interest in talking about the encounter, and feeling a vague but persistent sense of having been touched by something that is not quite of this world. The witnesses are, in the standard phrase of the period, shut up. The Men in Black case intersected with the official United States government record in two main ways. First is the FBI's involvement. The Bureau kept a small but real file on the Men in Black from the mid-1950s through the late 1960s. That file has been released in pieces under the Freedom of Information Act and is now in the FBI's online reading room. The released memos are short. They are mostly internal correspondence between field agents and FBI headquarters in Washington, reporting on individual MIB-type cases that came to the Bureau's attention. The prose is the dry, factual prose of FBI field reports. The memos describe witnesses, describe visitors, describe cars, and do not conclude in any of the released documents that the Men in Black were real. The memos do show, however, that the Bureau took the reports seriously enough to investigate them. Agents ran license plates, checked the names the visitors gave, and cross-referenced the visitor descriptions with Bureau personnel files. In some cases, the Bureau ruled that the visitors were not Bureau employees. In other cases, the Bureau could not determine who the visitors were. The cases were closed without further action. Second is the Air Force. Project Blue Book, the Air Force's official UFO study from 1952 through 1969, kept a small file on MIB-type cases now in the National Archives. It contains about 24 cases in which a UFO witness was visited after the fact by unidentified individuals claiming to be from a government agency. The Air Force's standard position was that no such visitors were Air Force personnel, and the Air Force did not investigate further. What is interesting, looking at the released FBI and Blue Book documents, is not the conclusion, but the assumption baked into the file. The official record treats the Men in Black as a real category of case, with real witnesses, requiring real investigation. It does not embrace the MIB as supernatural, and it does not dismiss the witnesses as crazy. The official record, in its bureaucratic way, treats the Men in Black as a phenomenon worth looking at, and then closes the case file. The most thoroughly documented of the Blue Book MIB cases is a 1957 incident in which a witness in the Midwest was visited by 3 men in dark suits who asked about a recent UFO sighting. The case is closed in the Blue Book file, with the notation that the visitors were not identified. The phrase "men in black" entered the cultural mainstream in the summer of 1997 when the Sony film of the same name opened. The film was a comedy starring Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones as agents of a secret government organization that polices alien activity on Earth. It took the phrase and turned it into a piece of pop culture furniture, jokes, toys, sequels, a Saturday morning cartoon. It did to the MIB case what the 1931 film Dracula did to the vampire case. It took a piece of folklore, drained it of its weight, and turned it into entertainment. The real MIB case, as documented by Barker and by John Keel and by the FBI files, has almost nothing to do with the movie. The real MIB are not funny, are not government agents in a secret organization with headquarters in a Manhattan high-rise, and in the witness statements are not even very well-defined individuals. They are shadows at the door, the visitors you cannot quite remember after they have left, a feeling as much as a face. The case is stranger than the vampire case, in some ways, because the witnesses are not from a pre-literate culture. They are mid-century Americans, with jobs, with cars, with telephones, with neighbors. They are not credulous rural people. The witnesses are shopkeepers, used car dealers, postal workers, school teachers, military officers, not people who would normally report a visit from a stranger in a dark suit as a haunting. The witnesses did report it, telling a story that was internally consistent, and that matched what other witnesses in other parts of the country were telling. The case was also taken seriously, in its period, by serious people. The astronomer J. Allen Hynek, who was the Air Force's scientific consultant on UFOs for 2 decades and later founded the Center for UFO Studies, mentioned the Men in Black pattern in his later writings. His successor at the center, the researcher Alan Hendry, included MIB cases in his catalog of unexplained UFO reports in the late 1970s. The Men in Black were, in other words, not the property of cranks. They were part of the data. So what is the answer to the question this channel is built on? What if the Men in Black were real? The honest answer is that the Men in Black were, in a precise sense, real. The phenomenon is real. The witnesses are real. The reports are real. The FBI files are real. The Blue Book files are real. The behavioral pattern is real. The fear the witnesses felt is real. The consistent description across hundreds of cases of dark suits, black cars, no emotion, slightly wrong complexion, vague warnings, and no agency name is real. The Men in Black are part of the historical record, in the same way that witchcraft accusations are part of the historical record, in the same way that fairy sightings are part of the historical record, in the same way that alien abduction claims are part of the historical record. The phenomenon is real, even if the underlying explanation is not supernatural. The question of what the Men in Black actually were is the part the historical record does not settle. The record leaves open whether the visitors were government agents of an unacknowledged program, private individuals who had taken it upon themselves to silence witnesses, a piece of the period's wider wave of UFO-related paranoia, magnified by the small UFO magazines of the era, and fed back into the witnesses' memories, or something stranger than any of these. The record, in this case, holds the question open. The pattern of the MIB case, in other words, is not a debunking case. The pattern is a documentation case. The witnesses, the files, the descriptions, the cars, the suits, and the warnings are all on the record. A definitive answer to who the men were is not in any of the released documents. The Men in Black are, in this sense, a real unsolved case in 20th century American history. Unsolved not because the question is silly or the witnesses unreliable, but because no one has been able to fit the pattern into any of the categories the official record was prepared to use. The viewers who keep coming back to this channel are the viewers who are interested in cases like this. Cases where the question is more interesting than the answer, where the pattern on the record is the story, and where the Men in Black, whoever they were, have earned a permanent place in the long American catalog of strange visitors. That is what the record shows. The record is open. The question is yours.